So as we saw in the last video, our moral choices can be thought about as balancing four factors. One of those factors was the goodness of the consequences that come about from our actions. Now, one prominent strain in ethical theory among philosophers is trying to understand all of the factors in terms of good consequences. Now, an important question for philosophers like that to answer is, what makes certain consequences good? Mill's theory says that what makes certain consequences good or bad is the pain or pleasure they bring about. So why did Mill think that pain and pleasure were so important? One way of getting at this is trying to understand the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. Things that are intrinsically valuable are valuable in themselves. So Mill thought pain and pleasure are valuable in themselves. Things that are instrumentally valuable are only valuable because they bring about other things that are themselves intrinsically valuable. So an example of this would be like money or gold or diamonds. Those things are valuable because they bring about other things that are valuable, because they induce pain or pleasure in the viewers. So Mill thought that pain and pleasure really had to be the basics of what made consequences good or bad. So his rough view is whether or not action is moral or immoral is determined by the amount of pain or pleasure it brings about. That leads to another question that he considered. Whose pain and pleasure? So let's return to our example of rowing out a boat to save a person in a lake. Now suppose you are guided by the moral rule that said, bring about the most pleasure and prevent the most pain. And then ask yourself, whose pleasure and whose pain? Well, it seems as though in this case, we're not just thinking about ourselves when we row out the boat. We're not just thinking about our pain and our pleasure, but the person out there as well. Mill prominently thought that it was the total pain or pleasure that needs to be factored into our moral decisions. So that is ambiguous between two different views. One view is just that you kind of lump all the pain and pleasure together and require that the total amount be really big. It doesn't really care how it's distributed among the people. A really important different view is that not just you bring about the total amount of pain or pleasure, but that you balance it out between the individuals. So each individual has a high average amount of pleasure and a low average amount of pain. So prominent philosophers think that that's probably the best way of understanding what Mill was getting at. He said, your moral actions should bring about the highest average of pleasure in your fellow individuals and reduce the amount of pain in your fellow individuals. And all of us are part of the same kind of moral community. Now, there's some really striking consequences for this view. This means anybody who's capable of experiencing pain or pleasure is part of our moral community. If someone can, or something, some animal can experience pain or pleasure, they're part of our moral community and part of our moral decision making. Something that's even more basic and maybe everybody would agree to is a general principle of equality. Utilitarianism, as Mill presented it, means that everybody's pain and pleasure is equal. This rules out certain things that all of us think are immoral. So for example, it says that racism is immoral. Disvaluing other people just purely on the basis of their race is not something that utilitarianism endorses. Utilitarianism says if someone can experience pleasure and pain, they are equal morally to everyone else. Utilitarianism provides us with a very clear moral calculus. It says, choose those actions that bring about the highest average pleasure in our moral community, and those that reduce the amount of pain in our moral community.